good afternoon. I'm a little bit surprised, positively surprised, just because of the crowd sitting here. Is there no other interesting talk going on at the moment? Perhaps because it's in the shadows. Yeah, we'll see. So, my name is Karsten Samaschke. I'm co-founder and CEO of Cloudical. Damn it, we just changed our names. So, and I usually point to the guys using the wrong name. I just did it. So, minus point on my side. And I want to talk about the death of the developer. I just have 35 minutes. Usually I would talk about like 2 hours, 3 hours, 4 hours. I try to shorten that as much as possible. So I promise you it's going to be very highlighty. No, highlighty perhaps not, but very high-levelly. No code, just me talking and a lot of pictures and perhaps raising some questions on your end. So I try to do it as fast as possible. First of all, I want to give you a little bit of insight into the past, then about the current state, and then want to go over to the point where it might interest developers. Anybody a developer here? That's what a surprise. So I am a developer by origin myself. So I've been working in the good old times. So I started, and guys, it's like granddad telling you about the war. So I was starting back in 1996 with software development, and I basically grew from the first websites over to dynamic websites, mobile, later on desktop, or vice versa, and then into cloud environments. And there's one thing that I learned over time, that basically the way I executed in 1996 and in 2006, and perhaps even 2016, is not going to work anymore. And I want to show you why, and I want to ensure that you at least have the same kind of information that I gathered myself throughout the past years. So, the good old times, are they still alive? I bring there a question mark. So good old times, what are good old times? Good old times is like me sitting in a cellar, perhaps that's a good idea today, where there's a little bit colder, dark, me hacking there, perhaps having a conversation or twice in a month with a customer. Not that, less, a little of conversation, but basically me just coding. Me just sitting there and trying to find a solution to a problem. That is the good old times. But, and that's the problem, the challenges that we today face as developers, as architects, as somebody here with an ops perspective? Really? And you dare to raise your hands? As an ops team with an ops perspective are a lot more challenging than what I was facing back then, and perhaps what you were facing some 5 years ago, or even today. Customers and shareholders demand faster development, like that, and a new version is there. Nice. Faster time to market. So bring in a solution, perhaps 80% of the solution, throw it out, and it works, and it is deployed faster. Faster reaction time. Something goes wrong, you guys need to react, and you need to react properly. You need to find out what went wrong. You need to provide a fix, and then again, throw it out. Better scalability. That's the reason why we are talking about containers, for example. That's the reason why we're talking about cloud. Sure, we want to reach like 24/7 availability. We also want to have more automation in place. We want to have rollbacks and quality of service, and that's the then basically interesting thing. We want to have that with lower costs. Well, my grandmother started her fairy tales with Once Upon a Time, and that feels a little bit like that. And the bad thing is that's not even it. There is way more that customers, partners, our teams expect from us. That's just the situation. It's not like complaining. That's just like what I am facing. And as a CEO of a company, I pretty much changed roles. What I'm demanding from my guys working for, with, for customers and me in that regard. So, period. And then there is something that you could feel like it could trouble you, or it could give you hope. I present you with a site. That site is from Gerald Pfeiffer, which is SUSE's CTO. SUSE, perhaps you heard about them, Linux company and now cloud company, independent, the biggest open source vendor as of now. And he says, IT and cloud are getting more and more into the center of organizations. Well, that's a nice little sentence, but have you thought about the implications? You as developers? The CEO is going to blame you. The CEO is demanding solutions from you. And not only the CEO, I mean, we all can play the CEO, no worries there. The customers do that as well. The stakeholders do that as well. Pretty much everybody is bringing you into the center of their attention, demanding solutions from you, demanding something like magic from you, day in, day out. Amazing. Sounds like a dream job. That is the point where the cloud comes into the place. And cloud is quite often understood as we do a lift and shift. We just take our solutions, bring it into a cloud environment. Again, some magic happens, and every problem is solved. Well, no. Perhaps let me think of that no. Let me think deep of that no. That's not going to happen. I give you a number. 95%. What am I going to say with that? Well, 95% of customers in an AWS environment complain after a year that they have way higher infrastructure cost than expected upfront. 95%. I should have bought Amazon shares upfront. The point is that perhaps a lift and shift approach and perhaps something like, let's do it as we did it in the past, is not going to work out anymore. Welcome to my hell. Welcome to my hell as developer. Welcome to my hell as CEO. Welcome to my hell as architect. And welcome to my hell as somebody who understands ops teams. I learned it. Took quite a while. But we have something for the rescue, right? Cloud nativeness. Yes. Cloud nativeness solves all the problems. I'm the CEO of a company that claims to be cloud native by mindset, by approach, and by everything else. Let me put it that way. We have new approaches in architecture, middleware, organization, and culture. Yes. We have microservices, amazing stuff there, like small little services doing one thing, doing it good. And those microservices are pretty much an answer we usually give. Microservices, who is not aware of microservices? Good. So you all know about them, loosely coupled, HTTP, HTTPS, termination, single purpose, pipapo, the whole stuff there. Did you ever work with microservices? On a scale? Like not only one or two, like dozens, hundreds? Some not, some are more like no. Well, let me put it that way, and perhaps the guys that nodded will agree to that. Don't do that without thinking into it and getting into it. Because what you do there is you do not only scale your services, amazing stuff, you also scale your complexity if you do not do it right. Great, we have cloud-native environments, we have microservices, and we scale the complexity. Is it a solution? Not too sure. But containers are the solution, right? We are at ContainerDays. Containers for the rescue. Container do away with complexity? No. There was a nodding, but no, not really. They provide an easy way of abstraction. Good thing, really good thing. They provide us with an easy way of basically virtualization. Good stuff, really good stuff. But as a developer, you are not only responsible now for your application, you are also responsible for the infrastructure running inside the container. Do you know what I call that? More complexity. Let me put it then again that way. I haven't heard of a problem being solved by just adding more complexity to the game. At least I did not manage to do that. But there's the technology for the rescue. Kubernetes. Perhaps you don't know the systems, and the SUSE guys might be sorry with me if I point to the wrong one, saying the wrong product. Kubernetes, OpenShift, SUSE CAS, SUSE CAP, like products that are supposed to run your middleware, your containers, to take away complexity from you. That's state-of-the-art middleware that's continuously improved, secure by design, and that's basically the industry standards for running containerized workloads, open source. We have a huge and ever-growing community because we are sitting here, standing here, to some extent. So, Kubernetes for the rescue? Who has rolled out a Kubernetes? Okay, who has rolled out a CloudFoundry? One, me, two. How do we orchestrate our dozens or hundreds of services then? We need something like a Kubernetes, right? And yes, I agree with that. But adding a Kubernetes to the game adds what? Complexity for the win. And let's add another layer of complexity because we want to have everything as a service nowadays. It's not like just writing an application, installing it by hand, rolling it out. No, it has to be infrastructure as a service. It has to be platform as a service. It has to be software as a service. Basically allowing us to add customer service, applications management, and more of those things to the games. Guys, that does not sound like a developer's position anymore. That's not a role I learned some 25 years ago. That's not going to work out, right? At least not if we perhaps do not change something. So we need to understand that, and we need to adopt that. What we have is a bunch of new technology, solving problems that did not exist before, bringing in solutions, but bringing in more, perhaps all, more. Thank you. So, question mark. Is that all? Let me look at my watch. No, it's not. There's more. Technology is only one factor, and I do not want to basically demotivate you. But there is more in the game. What about DevOps? What about cross-functional cooperation, automation, agility, change of mindset, and what about good architecture, more automation, security, data ownership? There is a discussion pretty much right after that one here at the big stage. You should perhaps attend that as well. It's going to be interesting because part of what they discuss there is like who and where and what is data ownership, who is responsible for what. Is it always a good idea to bring everything into AWS, Microsoft, Google environments? Let me give you a small hint. No. But that's just my opinion. What about good and nice things like vendor logins? Developers, do we love vendor logins? The answer, complexity, is the wrong answer here. I just tell you. What about trustworthy dependencies? I come to that a little later. What about compliance? What about mindset? Guys, we have a problem. The developer that we started being some, or if I look at you, I really feel old, like some years ago, that developer, that kind of approach, that kind of mindset, that kind of understanding a role is dead. I mean, it's there, but it's dead. It's not going to fulfill all of those requirements. It's not being able to handle everything that is thrown at the poor developer. That's why developers are well paid nowadays. but nonetheless, a lot of requirements. And I have that in my own teams sometimes. And frankly, it's always like eat your own dog food. I myself fall back into my old behaviors, like sitting there just coding and feeling like it's going on, it's going forward. It's not going to work anymore. And that's just the situation. So what now? Shall we perhaps quit our jobs? That was a rhetorical question. You could answer with yes, but then perhaps you should quit the job to some extent. No, definitely not. What we need to do as developers is we need to take that kind of garbage that is thrown at us and make something positive out of it. And that basically implies that we as developers need to reinvent ourselves. Just this morning, when I basically headed over to the speakers lounge, I had a discussion with one of the other speakers sitting there, and he basically said, like, you know, most of the developers nowadays do not develop solutions from scratch anymore. They just write glue code around existing frameworks. I just take that and work with that for a second. What does that imply? That kind of working or writing glue code around existing frameworks implies that I have to understand that kind of code, obviously. And it implies that I perhaps need to have a different picture of my application. Back in the days, when I was younger-ish, like whatever. Back in the days, I was working with an architect. The architect basically drew me the big picture and then told me, like, write that class with that kind of interfaces, with that kind of variables being exposed. No, don't expose the variables, encapsulate them and the likes. That was what the architect gave me. He had the big picture, and I was the developer. I was not happy with that, but it worked because we had some sort of, everybody of us had his job. Well, today, as developers, we need to be architects. We need to understand the whole picture. When we are writing glue code, we need to understand what we are gluing together, right? When we are bringing in frameworks, solutions, approaches, we need to be sure that it works out in the end. So, the architect is dead. Oh, a lot of casualties today. The architect is dead. And the new developer is a combination of architect and developer. It's not going to work out differently if you work with microservices and the likes. You need to be an architect. You need to be a solutions architect. You need to be a designer. And that's most worrying, you need to look into those things. You need to develop that kind of mindset. Because the classical architect vanished, and that is basically gone to something like a solutions architect or an enterprise architect. But the classical software architect is not there anymore, quite often. So, you are the architects. Does that add complexity? Question mark. Or does it perhaps add some sort of relief? Think of that. There's no definite answer to that, but think of that. You are the architects of the solution. Then, very, very easy thing. Glue code. Bringing together some code that is coming from somewhere. Writing or referencing containers. Well, you need to have something pretty easy like a secure and trustworthy CI/CD pipeline. And let me ask you that question. Can you trust Docker Hub? Can you trust any publicly available container registry? No is a good answer. Anybody answering with complexity? No. You cannot. A friend of mine, a developer like I was, told me like already 15, 20 years ago, he was some sort of a mentor to me. He said, do not trust anything you cannot throw out of the window. Have you ever tried throwing Docker Hub out of the window? Have you ever tried throwing anything in a cloud environment out of the window into the garbage bin or whatever? No. So don't trust it. But that has implications. Just with short words. The CI/CD pipeline does not allow external binary content. Period. Everything you bring in needs to be built, compiled, and if you have some sort of compiler there, brought into the game as source code. It simply has to. And that also applies to the container images you are using. So perhaps talk to your ops guy. He can perhaps help you in setting up a container image from a trustworthy source. He is a trustworthy source. I'll come to that a little later again. There was another ops guy here. Now they are 3 already. So we have 3 trustworthy sources here. Those guys are responsible for bringing in the basic foundation of your environment because the application is not anymore something like just code. It is a complete and encapsulated environment, right? So everything in there needs to be secure, trustworthy, and there are no excuses to that. Code is built inside and by the help of the CI/CD pipeline in your environment, and only the artifacts being built there are referenced and used within your application, regardless of where you utilize them, regardless of doing that on your own system, in a public cloud environment, or wherever. So that changes a lot, because guess who's responsible for setting up that CI/CD pipeline? Or at least heavily involved there. Let me put it that way. It's not the project manager. It's perhaps the developer. Also, we need to bring in transparency and automation. Because in the end, speaking of complexity, how can you address complexity? You cannot address it by hand. There's no way of you being able to deploy some hundreds of microservice instances by hand. You can do that, but it takes hours. And there's no way for the poor ops guys to run and operate some hundreds of microservices instances. They can do that. But guess what happens if something goes wrong? You do not only scale your application, you also scale your problems. The container is gone, the log is gone, no understanding of where something occurred. Who has ever tried to operate a cloud-native application? Let me tell you something. You want to have tools that do that for you. You want to have automation in place. SSH is dead. You want to have a tool chain, a platform that you can basically rely upon. And speaking of that, you perhaps do not want to set it up by hand as well. So automation is king, and transparency is king. Transparency means your application needs to report things differently. Speaking of centralized logging, centralized tracing approaches, for example. Your application needs to perhaps integrate differently into an environment. You do not care? You are a developer? You build it, you run it. Ever heard of that? Welcome to the new world. So, you want to have that kind of tool chain in there. You want to have that kind of automation, and that's the point where I usually flip over, like I should do that myself. You should do that from the very beginning. Who has ever tried to set up a CI/CD pipeline with an already running project while doing deployments? Let me put it that way. It's not going to work. Or it's going to work, but it's hard work. It's really hard work. It's not going to work. Do that upfront. Automate everything. Get rid of handwork. Nothing should be done by hand in your modern cloud-native environments. That also applies to provisioning infrastructure as well. So, transparency and automation. And if you write some code, the first thing you should bring in to your code is a dependency that allows you to have something like centralized tracing and logging. Because your wonderful microservices container is simply killed by the environment if something is not going as it is supposed to happen. If there is load on one machine and the environment decides to bring something onto the other machine, guess what happens? It starts a new instance and it simply kills the old instance. There's nothing like we do some magic transfer there. It's gone. And gone is your log. Gone is your trace. And the tracing. Guys, get rid of those debug outputs. Forget it. It's not working in a cloud-native environment. No way of handling that. So transparency, automation, integration. That's not it. It's hard to see, but it's reading like DevSecOps, and the underline is uniting different species. Everybody of you has heard of DevOps, don't you? Many companies understand DevOps as, I said, a developer and an ops guy onto the same table. Guess what you have then? You have a developer and an ops guy sitting on the same table. And the outcome is? Death of the developer. That could happen. That could happen. That could lead to an immediate death of the developer. Perhaps it could also happen that it leads to an immediate death of the ops guy. Who would prevent? No, we are not asking that. Which kind of death is to be preferred there? The point is, DevOps or DevSecOps, security involved. I, as a developer, love security. Not. But it needs to be there because, again, if you have an unsecure application, you do not only scale your application, you also scale your security holes and your security issues. Welcome to the new world. And guess who's responsible for that? No, do not point to the ops guy. Do not point to the security guy. And do not point to the program manager, project manager, whatever. Point to yourselves. You are responsible for that. So, DevSecOps, SecDevOps, DevOpsSec, whatever, is a mindset. It's a culture of speaking with each other. It's a culture of allowing mistakes to happen and fixing them jointly. It's a culture of discussion. It's a culture of errors and learning from them. And if it's not executed upon properly, it's simply just an excuse. Nothing more. And then it adds to your complexity if you don't do it right. Agility and iteration. Yeah, sure, we are all agile. Have you ever spoken to shareholders, stakeholders, shareholders perhaps as well, stakeholders? Do you know what they understand as agility? I tell you today what you are supposed to do tomorrow. That is agility for them. Let me put it that way, no. Let me think of that again, no. That's not agility. That's not iteration. Agility and iteration is a process executed upon. I've seen the number. Agility and iteration is something that you as developers have to live. And believe me, perhaps look at your colleagues, not at yourselves, because you are perfect. But look at your colleagues. You will find colleagues that are not able to work in an agile environment, that are not able to work iteratively, that try to find a 100% solution upfront. Well, that's not agility, right? So, sorry? He just said that's the security guy. Then we need to train the security guy as well. Because it's then again a mindset, right? Part of the mindset is also cross-functional cooperation. Not only development, operations, and security need to be involved. Also things like legal, marketing, sales, other stakeholders like customers. Heard of them? Those guys writing that bad kind of documents. They need to be involved from the beginning, because later on you are lost. You are lost. The ops guys say, I need to work with what I have there. The security guy says, I've pointed out every kind of security issues. And who's to blame? Don't you want to raise your heads? You are to blame then once again. And the same is with automation. I need to make it a little shorter. The same is with automation. So, take that into account. Is that good old developer I was depicting in the very beginning, me, like 2 years younger? Yeah, 20 years younger, 30 years, whatever. Is that developer still existing? No, because modern developers are completely different. I would perhaps not be a good modern developer, at least not with my mindset I had some 20 years ago. We are cross-functionality skilled. We are able to work agile and iteratively. We automate. We ensure security and trustworthiness. We, not somebody else. We communicate, one of our strongest points. And we improve ourselves every day. Guys, that basically means rest in peace, good old developer. And guess why I did not cover writing code? Because that's the only part that is at least to some extent still the same, although it is mostly glue code nowadays. But everything else around has changed. Everything else is gone, needs to be gone, and needs to be replaced with new approaches, new mindsets, enablement, the will to change. And that is one last point. You guys need to change. Everybody of you. It's pretty easy to point to the colleague next to you and say, like, oh, I do not want to point to anybody here. You need to change. Well, you need to change, not him, you. So, rest in peace, developer. And welcome, new cross-functional monster. So, questions? No, just I perhaps repeat it then. If there's a different question, just throw it over the fence there.
Till 7 years ago, the developers used to write.
It is a microphone.
Yes, it is.
Amazing.
They used to write a 3 tiers application, right? And you didn't mention the complexity of writing real microservices with bounded context and all what is related to that.
Yeah.
I think it's hard to find real microservices developer as well. So that's what our experience is when we look at Stack Overflow jobs and to find some.
Yeah. But there is reason for that. Yeah. Because if you want to write a microservice properly, if you want to do that in the right environment, if you want to execute upon that like with perfection, which is not achievable, but if you want to do that the right way, then there's so much to learn. There's so much to change, and some things are not even under your control. You need to have the right environment for that. Basically, writing a microservice is still like writing a 3-tiered application to some extent. You have your data layer, perhaps if you have some communications with a backend environment, you have perhaps some sort of business logic inside that microservice, and you have a front end. To some extent, it's still a 3-tiered application, but that's not in the center anymore, like it was in the past. So the point is that kind of microservice developer needs to know so much more that those guys usually consider themselves to be architects nowadays. And that's pretty much without a smile in that regard, because it's a sad situation.
But what they develop are microlists. And yeah, it's really, unfortunately, the case, and not really microservices.
Yeah. And then again, that brings us to the point, it's not like technical expertise, it's more like the whole environment, the whole ecosystem. And that is then the hard thing to accept, because for us as developers, perhaps also for the ops guys, we do not have it under control anymore. We are dependent on our environment. We need to have an environment that allows us to execute properly. And let me put it that way. I've been working with enterprises, with small companies, with medium-sized companies, and we screwed up pretty much every project. And we did that because it was not under our control. If the environment does not allow it, you end up scaling your costs, your problems, everything else. And you do not end up, I don't know, lowering costs, bringing in more automation. That's achievable. But the point is, that's just achievable with pain, right? And most of the companies, most of the organization try to achieve that without pain. That again leaves me to the question, not a question to be answered, it's more like a question I have to ask myself. How do I want to execute in there? Do I do it as I did it in the past, but more like with microservices nowadays? Or do I do it differently? Do I perhaps go into freelancer area, whatever? And that question is very hard to answer there, but that's part of the problem. Basically, that's the problem.
Yeah, but to make use of the capabilities of Kubernetes and Istio and service meshes to deploy independently microservices and scale them without breaking the system, it's really difficult. You don't find it's so easily such kind of developers.
It is definitely difficult. It's not the best, but because you also scale difficulty. But the point is, it can be achieved, but it is a learning curve. It is a path. And as with every path, I need to start. And then again, I mentioned that you need to have an environment that allows for errors, for mistakes, for problems, for things that basically do not work out. Because you learn from that errors. And that's why I usually tell customers that it does not make sense to expect something like a cloud-native environment, fully working with everything within weeks. That's more than months, perhaps years. Also, again, those kind of 80% solution versus the 100% solution. And then again, that is hard to accept also with my sense of perfection there. It changes. It is an iterative way, an iterative approach. And if you ever reach the goal, I don't know. Really, I don't know. I run an organization, right? And even within our organization, and we are centered around cloud nativeness, open mindsets, new work, and the likes. It's hard to achieve because you are always working in a very complex environment, and it is not always in your hands. So there's nothing negative with that. It's more like you need to accept that, right? And you need to execute upon that path. And that is then again the thing like looking at your face. It can demotivate to some extent. And it is quite often an uphill battle. But in the end, looking back, there is improvement. And perhaps that small steps and chunks of improvement are worth it. Even the big companies like Google, like LinkedIn, like Microsoft, like Amazon that live in the microservices world for like 10 years, 15 years, 20 years, they iterate, they improve, they get better, and they screw up massively every day. But that's part of our environment, part of our ecosystem, part of what's going on. And then again, we as developers at least need to accept that. And need to work with that, and need to get better ourselves, and then improve our colleagues, help them improve, and get rid of that ass-covering mentality. So it is pretty much part of a big picture, of a big game that is going to happen there. So no good answer there. Just nodding and saying, yes, complexity. So more questions? Comments? Tomatoes you want to throw? If not, then thank you for your attention. It was my pleasure.